our reading this week is from not Isaiah, 1 Kings 19. This is the 19:1 through 18, I believe it is, 1 Kings. So we're jumping to the story of Elijah, or jumping into the story of Elijah, because there are Elijah is one of the great prophets, but this is towards the end of Elijah's time. Okay, so I got to find where I put this note. Okay, there it is. So it's 1 Kings 19:1 through 18. Now, remember that it wasn't long before this that Elijah had the preceding scene. Elijah has several really important scenes. One was with the widow of Zarephath, where he's out of Judah, he's out of Israel, and he leaves from Israel to Zarephath. And he has two different encounters on this way. One was with the ravens, if you remember, who feed him, and then with this widow of Zarephath, whose son is dying. And Elijah, they're starving, and Elijah then resuscitates the son, but he also, this starving family, gives them this gift of bread that will never run out. And in that there is a conversion story. A conversion story. This widow converts to faith in the one true God. The next, there's like three acts in Kings 17 through 19 that look, and have to do with Elijah. And so every act begins with some sort of announcement. Okay, the first one in 17, Elijah announces this drought, and then this drought leads him away from King Ahab, who is the king of Israel, and he goes to a new journey from Ahab back to Ahab, and then he has to run from Jezebel, because he had in this encountered Jezebel, the queen whose priests, Baal, it might have been Baal, or more like one of the it was another religion. The priests he had challenged, and remember he beat them all up pretty bad. They all died. It was a terrible slaughter, according to the story. So then he encounters these ravens, and then he encounters the widow. And the second is chapter 18. He is given an announcement by God that he needs to go to Israel, and I think he has to okay, I'm trying to make sure I get this right. This is where the encounter happens. There's a threat by Jezebel, but then this is the encounter that happens where he destroys the priests, like this. So then Jezebel's going to get his head. He's got to flee again. So the announcement is by Jezebel that she's going to kill him. And so he's journeying from Israel, and he ends up in Zarephath with this woman. So I'll read first. I'll just read this. Oh, let's just go by paragraph. That'll be fine.
Okay, and you're going to start 19?
We'll start in 19:1.
Okay.
So King Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah. This is the announcement, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." In other words, you're dead. Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there.
But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stone, and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat. Otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there.
Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For Israelites have forsaken our covenant, thrown down our altars, and killed our prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away."
Go for it.
Pick up on what he said.
He says, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. Excuse me. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, for the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with a sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away."
Now, Peter, let Peter finish this up.
Okay. Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram, and also you shall anoint Jehu son of Nimshi as king over Israel, and you shall anoint Elisha son of Shaphat of Abel-Maholah as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill. And whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him."
Wow, that's pretty dim, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? The God speaks to Elijah in this series of anointings of these other kings, Aram and Hazael and Nimshi or Jehu, Aram and Israel, and then I applaud you, Peter. You just run right through Shaphat of Abel-Maholah. That was awesome. That was just so well done. We'll see. Dan's reading this weekend, so I know he's probably practicing right now. So what do you notice? What did any of you notice in this right now? What was the thing that jumped out to you?
Well, what jumped out at me was the word of the Lord came to him saying, "What are you doing there, Elijah?" When or is it Elisha?
Mm-hmm.
Elisha, what is he doing there? He was told to go there. What the kind of a question is that?
Yeah, the angel told him to go there.
Yeah. Or maybe the angel didn't tell Yahweh.
Yeah. Well, the angel. Yeah. And is that a rhetorical question? What are you doing here? Maybe it's not about what are you doing here, or deeper into what are you doing here? What are you up to? Now, Elijah's been through a lot, and this is a point where this is a turning point in Elijah's ministry. And Elijah, he is to go and anoint these guys, and then he's turning over his role as prophet of Israel to Elisha. He's finding Elisha, and it isn't long after he finds Elisha, guess what? He's swept off in the fancy chariot, right? The chariot of fire. Da 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 da. And I ought to play that this weekend. If I just had more controls up front, I could get the chariots of fire and play that as I'm preaching. Just sound effects. I'm not going to do that, but it would be sort of funny. Yeah. So that's a really important thing. You know, Jezebel worships Baal, or Baal, and so she's upset because he had destroyed the prophets of Baal, the priests of Baal, and he flees. He runs away. Many days' journey from anyone else. He gives up on his own. He gives up on his own power, right? Because he said, "There's this giving up. It is enough now, O Lord, to take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." But he has been given power as the prophet of God through so many adventures and so many things. What else? What else did you?
Well, Elijah's answer is always the same.
What? Yeah.
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 When he says, "What are you doing here?"
I've been very zealous.
Yeah, and he says, and then
He's sort of whiny, isn't he?
yeah, he says, "Well, look at what I've done. But now they're going to take me away."
Right. So he's fearful. He's done all these powerful things. He's faced down all the prophets of Baal, and he's caused, that whole beautiful, wonderful story where he digs the ditch and fill it with water, and the water goes on fire, and the lightning comes down, or the fire comes from heaven and burns up the bowl, and he hasn't doused everything, right? He douses the whole temple, the whole beer, the stack of wood, the beer that they put the sacrifice on, the sacrifice bull, and yet he's able to bring down fire and consume it all. And then this terrible slaughter of the prophets of Baal. That's power. He's shown power. He's done this wonderful. He's shown power in the story about the widow of Zarephath and her son, and raising him to life, and creating this opportunity where they can eat. And here he is. I can do no more. I'm worn out.
I'm wondering, is it really possible for to survive 3 years of drought? That's kind of incredible. I mean,
well, I mean, if it wasn't really 3 year drought. I mean, I do think when we interpret or look at Scripture, are we thinking, are we thinking about it as being historically correct, or is it pointing to another kind of truth? The 3 years of drought indicates what? A very severe famine. A very, very severe famine. But what was the Dust Bowl? The Dust Bowl was considered considerably long.
20-some years.
Yeah, several years. I mean, it was. I grew up. My grandparents had a farm in Nebraska, and they talked about those years. They were able to subsist, but they didn't prosper. I mean, but a lot of people didn't prosper, and they moved out and went on. And I guess I look at some of these things and think about these stories, and they're so fantastical, especially in this portion of the Bible. It's like, could you really go 40 days and 40 nights literally on a cake, on a nice Johnny cake or whatever it is?
No, it's been done. I mean, even recently.
Yeah. There's been some of that. Yeah, you can go with water. You can go quite a bit of time. I have a cheat sheet here. Let me read a couple things. Elijah journeyed to Mount Horeb. That's where he goes, which is a 40-day walk into the wilderness. It's notable that Horeb, which means in Hebrew dry place, which is interesting. It's a dry place, and then the storm comes upon it, right? Is the name used previously in the book of Deuteronomy. In Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, though, this mountain is called. So it has significance, even though in Kings, this is Mount Sinai. Scholars will tell us. And they also, in linguistic context, the mention of 40 days might be to make a connection to Moses, right? who also spent 40 days in Sinai. Or it might be just a formulaic number indicating a great distance that Elijah walked. The number 40 is often found throughout the Bible, 40 days, 40 nights, 40 this, 40 that, as indicate a non-specific large number, like the 40 days and 40 nights of the Great Flood, or Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness. There's some question whether this, when you linguistically look at the language from these ancient tongues or ancient texts, are they specifically meaning 40 as in numerical 40, or is it a number that indicates just a long time in the wilderness? Now, I can think of, I got to think about, there's, 1,000, sometimes even in our own day in English, there will be examples of authors, writers, songwriters, even in colloquial usage, in idioms, to say like, it was a million years, it felt like a million years, right? Or it felt like 1,000 years, or which are colloquial uses of that language instead of. And that's the hard thing is one thing to remember about Hebrew is, I believe the earliest sources we have in Hebrew, they don't have all the little dots or jots and tittles, the little dots and stuff that indicate language and actually indicate how these words might be used. It's only the aleph and the bet and the gimel and the dalet, the alphabet. So like there. Now I don't have the exact. So one of the things about King David, right? Oh, let's see. How do you do it? I'd have to look at David in Hebrew. But David, I'm going to have to look this up. This is really interesting. The word David in Hebrew, okay? Let me see. I'm looking, because I don't write Hebrew as much as I did in school. Okay. In Hebrew, which goes backwards, this is David, right? That's David in Hebrew. This is the Dalet, the Vav, and the Dalet. Okay, that's David. But it can this thing, depending on how it's written, could also mean bar. Like so one of my professors was talking about the only historical evidence existing outside of the biblical account of David is found on a rock somewhere in Judah or in Israel, and it could either mean David or Devar, which means something else, which doesn't mean David. And so they don't know if, because it's worn down, it's a carving, it's worn down after 40 centuries or whatever. So that's one of the difficulties of biblical interpretation. We're looking at texts that have gone through multiple translations and and some of these texts weren't written down except on stone, or if it was on papyrus or other skin or anything. Those things have long since rusted away. It was like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those Dead Sea Scrolls are sometimes just pieces of pieces, and they can piece together sections and see where they've survived into our English translations, but they're still Aramaic, or they're still Greek, or they're still Hebrew. So the setting. Okay, so according to my note here, Elijah humiliated and killed all 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, then traveled 17 miles east to Jezreel, and then 100 miles to Beersheba, and then, which are both in Judah. From there he traveled into the wilderness, eventually reaching Horeb, and they say a location that is still not to be able to be located precisely by scholars, but some people think that Horeb is, guess what? Sinai. Ahab, the king that he is, Elijah is the prophet to, he ruled Israel from 869 to 850 before Christ, 3,000 years ago, and was condemned by the prophets. Not only Elijah was condemned for a number of reasons. Among these was his marriage to Jezebel, who was the daughter of the king of Sidon, Ethbaal, and his subsequently he adopted the worship of Baal. So the king turns from Israel. He turns from the God of Israel to worship Baal. Interesting that in this story, the women are typically not major characters in earlier biblical literature. It's noteworthy that that two women take are powerful roles in this story. The widow Zarephath, which is a positive story, and then Jezebel, who is a negative character. According to this note, it says, although the increasingly centralized power structure of Israel, this under the king, power was increasingly centralized, but that had also sent women to the periphery, to the margins more. But then you have Jezebel, who's not only a woman, but a woman from another tribe. She's from another country, another people. And then Zarephath, the widow, is not of Israel either. She's a widow outside of Israel. And it says right here that 5 of the 8 miracle stories throughout First Kings and 2 Kings, 5 of 8 feature women, which is sort of flipping the script of what would have been the experience of people at that time, that day and age, and which we see in the Bible time and time again, always flipping the script, always doing something different from the cultural expectations or the power expectations, right? God always flips things around. Jesus, so much of Jesus' story is about flipping. There's no longer, and Paul emphasizes that so much. And that's really what's cool about Paul, is that he comes from the power structure. And then after his conversion, he continually points out how God upsets the earthly power structure, female, Greek over Jew, or Roman over Jew, and so on. The main call of Elijah, according to this, is that to eliminate Israel's worship of Baal, which had been introduced through Jezebel by King Ahab. Even built a temple, right? Elijah was, according to this, Elijah was the sole remaining prophet of the Lord who had not been killed or run out by Jezebel. So he was the one remaining prophet of Israel, of the God of Israel. And he killed 450. Every one of them in this big story. Anything else jumps out?
This is, you start at the 1st of 19, and it looks like Elijah's scared. He wants to run away, so he does, and it says, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. And then there were some angels that came and helped him.
Right.
But is this what God really wanted him to do? Because then he comes in and he says, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
And then he repeats everything he's done, goes on a little bit farther, and then all these things happen, and he doesn't see God in all this stuff, and then all of a sudden there's God saying, what are you doing here, Elijah?
Mm-hmm.
And then, so is it a test? Because then it says, okay, you're okay now, Elijah, you can go back to the wilderness, and now the things you're going to do aren't going to be quite as bad.
Mm-hmm.
So
And it's a different call, isn't it? One of the things that God does, is issue a different call to Elijah. He's no longer, Elijah is no longer called to be the prophet, to destroy, to counter Baal. In his fear, he runs away. He kind of gives up on himself and on God. So take this away from me, which is reminiscent of Jesus on the night before the cross. Take this away from me in the Garden of Gethsemane. But he's given one more task, and that task is to what? Anoint 2 kings,
right.
to continue this work, to eliminate and kill the people who turned against, which is a terrible thought. But then to also anoint Elisha as his successor, giving him, so this is sort of like the end of Elijah's his last duties.
I just think he could have said something different than, what are you doing here, Elijah?
Yeah, I'm wondering if that, I really think that's sort of rhetorical in a way. I sort of see that as, like, why did this come out this way for you, Elisha? What are you thinking?
Why are you here, not where I sent you?
Pardon?
Why are you here, not where you should be?
Yeah. Why have you abandoned? What's behind this action?
But Elijah justifies it by saying, okay, look, God, I just did all this. I'm a little bit scared here.
I think that's what he wants to do, is admit his fear, his whatever.
Yeah. Let's see what my friend in the Message Bible says. That'll be interesting, because he always has an interesting take on it. Add parallel. The Message. 1 Kings 9, right? So, now this is how he writes, okay. Wait, it's 19, isn't it?
19.
Duh. What the heck, Solomon? How did you get back here? Okay. Ahab, okay, When Elijah saw how things were, he ran for dear life to Beersheba, far in the south of Judah. He left his young servant there, and went on a journey the other day. And here's how he came to a lone broom bush and collapsed in its shade, wanting in the worst way to be done with it all, to just die. Enough of this, God, take my life. I'm ready to join my ancestors in the grave. And exhausted, he fell asleep under the lone broom bush. The angel says, get up and eat. That's all. Then said, get up and eat some more. You've got a long journey ahead of you. When he got there, he called into the cave. And then the word of God came to him. So Elijah, what are you doing here? I've been working out my heart. And this is really interesting. The word of God came to him. So, is this God actually speaking to him, or is this more like conscience? Because then the word says, and then he was told, go stand on the mountain at attention before God. God will pass by. So, the word of God, this speaking voice of God, the voice of God comes to him, but then there's this promise that God will pass by. It's an interesting point. Because
That's what Elijah was saying.
there's a difference between...
Did I understand what you said?
Yeah.
I mean, did I understand?
Yeah. Yeah. So here, so he hears God, hears word, but then he's told to go stand at attention and wait, because God will pass by. So this must be to see God. Then there's this great wind and the clouds and the clamor and the noise, When does he see God?
Small voice, isn't it?
Yeah, he sees him in the silence, right?
Mhm.
Sees God. And that's interesting because did he actually see God, or what does that mean? That's really
I
fascinating.
don't see in effect seeing God.
Well, here it says, he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain, for the Lord is about to pass by."
Mhm.
There was a great wind, so strong it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And then after the earthquake, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence when Elijah heard it. And in the silence is where he encounters God. Maybe he doesn't see God.
Could it be that you expect to see God in mighty and great ways?
Well, I think so, yeah.
And you should maybe just look around close by in silence, and he probably has more
Right, God doesn't always appear.
presence. Yeah.
Mhm.
Presence is all around you, but you don't notice it because you're looking for.
There's still small voices. People will say
And
that.
it takes faith in that still small voice of the noise and thunder.
And I guess when you think of it that way, is that kind of like when we ask God for something and we just can't really figure out if he's answered us or not, and we say, okay, well, we're going to do this, and it's like, well, maybe that didn't work.
Mhm.
Or we think, now, is that what he really said? And I just, I feel for Elijah here. Because if it is, then the word of the Lord came to him. Is that like when we're thinking, is a prayer been answered? Was that the answer?
Yeah.
Am I supposed to be doing something different?
Right, or at least that question, is that the question? The word of the Lord came to him, right?
Yeah.
For me, I like when he heard the silence. When he heard it, the sound of sheer silence. When he heard it, when he heard nothing, he went out and wrapped his face and went out. And he wrapped his face because you don't see God. You'll die, right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes we tend to, and I think this might be in a way where I'll be going, this is Christ the King. This is All Saints Sunday.
Mm.
And we're going to spend a little extra time. There's going to be an opportunity during for all the saints, the first hymn, for people to go up and light a candle to remember those in their lives who have died this past year, or actually 2 years, because we didn't get to celebrate this in the same way together. And then at the end of our prayers of the day, we're going to ring a bell for everyone in our community who has died the past 2 years, right? We're going to list the 2020 and the 2021. We're going to read those names as a way to honor them. And that bell's going to ring out in the silence. There's going to be some time. But, sometimes God is found, I'm thinking about specifically for people who have, I think of Marie Anderson. 18 months waiting to say goodbye to her husband. To commit him, and having her two of her sons die in the middle of it all.
Yeah.
What a horrible thing.
Mm-hmm.
And having been through a death of a spouse, there are times when it's where the silence, you want to hear big things, you want to be distracted, you want to know that God's active or big signs. But it was in that quiet time when you were all alone that presence of God seemed to draw even more so near. And I'm sure for Marie and for others who have been through things like this in this last 2 years, it's those quiet times can be the most trying but also the most comforting. That God comes to us in the midst of that none of the distractions of everything else.
All of the translators would come up with a sound of sheer silence. And the other translations talk about a still small voice, which you can hear. It's a voice. But how can silence have a sound? It isn't silence, it's a sound. If there's a sound, there's no silence.
I wonder if it's a play on words, right?
No.
Doesn't no sound have a sound second? You know, if one definition of the word sound is waves of air, you know, sound waves, which are just basically movement of air that can be perceptively picked up by your ear as a physical description, mechanical description of what sound is. But if sound is something that one hears, silence can be a sound because it indicates nothing. Just like 0 is a number that indicates a lack of a number, right? I'm thinking about these different ways that things can be interpreted. I really think it's a play on words. The sound of sheer silence. I mean, the idea that nothing. I don't know if I've ever heard sheer silence. Maybe my ears ring too much or something, you know. I mean,
Little tinnitus?
not as bad as my dad.
Okay.
But no, there's,
Yeah.
there's always a little hiss or something going. I hear a hiss. When I've been in the most remote places that I've gone to in my life, and I haven't gone to terribly remote places, but there's always the sound of the breeze or the distance or something.
Well, but after all that noise that just came before it.
He might have been. Yeah, that's interesting. I want to look at something here, Peter. If you guys want to take a break and get, that's a really good point. I want to look something up.
And that Elijah knew that was his cue to go out in the final.
Yeah, how about that?
Too.
When he heard nothing.
When he heard nothing,
That was
then
when
he
his-
wrapped his face in the mantle and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. So he knew something was going to happen.
I'm going to look at one of my professors, Mark Throatbite, who's been here before. I just found, we studied in Old Testament class. We studied with Throatbite this, and I have a chart that I'm going to. No, that's just about the transformation and intervention. That's a thing set up. Okay, if you want to get a cookie or something, let me look here. I want to see where we are. I'm sorry, I'm not very good today.
I just got water in there.
You need a cookie?
Oh, okay.
I had a cookie, and then
You
I
need another
stumbled.
one.
I might have to have another one. There's just been a lot going on. There's just so much. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting, wonderful things going on. But for instance, we were, when was this? Yesterday? No, Tuesday night we had Board of Lay Ministries. And, Sunday at worship, we ran out of Lunchables. Right? No more Lunchables. And we have them on order. We had 1,000 on order. And so Monday or Tuesday, Carol called up to trace them and say, when are they going to get here? And they said, somewhere around the 19th. That means we have no communion packets for the weekend. And so we started thinking about it and said, well, maybe this is just a sign that we should forget the packets and move towards a different form of communion and try to keep it as safe as we can. Well, it just so happened that on a whim, I bought a pouring chalice, a common cup with a little lip that you can pour into a glass. Instead of having everything preset, people picking them up and stuff. And so we started thinking about how could we use that pouring chalice. And so we're going to start, we're not going to kneel yet because that puts people in proximity and stuff. But, so if you imagine the pews, Okay, here's the chancel and the table and the stairs and the pulpit and lectern right here. So that's going to be me, and over here is going to be the other server, and there's going to be a tray of empty cups here and a basket here. And what we ask people to do is come out of it when they're let out of their pew, come here, cup your hands. We're going to talk about this, not to reach. I don't want to be touching fingers, but cup your hands. I'll carefully put a paper in your hand. And then you will step here, pull down your mask, eat it. Put your mask back up, go here, pick up a cup, go here to the server, put your cup out, pour from the common cup that we all share, step over here, take off your mask, drink it, discard, and then go back to your seat. And we'll just do it one side at a time, right? And so and one thing about continuous communion, as opposed, there are two main recommended ways of communion in the ELCA. And one is, this is a Bible study, but I'm excited to tell you about it. There's table communion, and there's continuous. And what's interesting about table, that's how you typically do it, right? Everybody comes here, boom, 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 and kneels, and everybody is communed back and forth. Yeah. They come along, everybody's communed, and at the end, say the body and blood of the Lord Jesus Christ, or whatever the words that were used. There's a dismissal, and that really stresses the unity of the people lined up. But there are always other people down here who aren't part of that, right? Plus, it excludes some of our people in wheelchairs and walkers because you can't get up the steps. Continuous communion sets up this continual motion of people coming to the table of mercy and receiving and coming from. And we'll go to the other side. This guy will Dan will just go there. And there's this continual motion. And part of the reason they talk about that motion is that symbolizes also, and reminds us that we are part of a greater circle of saints, right? It's not just us coming to the table. It's all the other churches, all the other Lutherans, all the other Christians coming to this table week after week. Not only now, but before and after. So there's two real foci there. And then with continuous, you can do common cup, where actually people drink from the cup, which may or may not be a more hygienic way than people think, because the lips wiped every time, and the wine has some value.
Yeah.
But then there's intinction. Have you ever done intinction?
But
Where you dip?
Yeah.
The dip. And then there's the common pour, common cup, common pour. I like the common pour because we still receive from the same cup. Like Jesus passed the cup among his people. But we don't get into, just in case somebody has scabies or something, they drink from that cup, or they have bad something on their fingers. And I like that when we do continuous. There's table communion, but then there's also the one we've been practicing is in place, which is not something Lutherans do very much. I think Mormons do it. Some of the other churches of the Reformation, I think Amish, and everybody, it's passed down to everybody, and then once everybody drinks together. So we're going to do that because, and then we'll sort of see how that goes, and then at some point we'll start using the table communion again too. One thing I like about this for us is that people like Carol and Marv are included in the same action, right? They can come up. We'll bring anybody with mobility issues will come first. And we don't have to climb stairs. We don't have to do any of that stuff. And it's actually quick, fairly quickly. And there's this constant movement. And we'll try not to have a lot of lines, try to ask people to stay. separated, family units. You can be right by your wife or spouse or whatever. So, did anybody want to get a cookie or anything? Is everybody okay? Oh, Mr. Coffee.
Continue coffee.
Mm.
Bad habit of mess cook.
So, when that notice came down Tuesday, that everything about worship had to be changed, because all of a sudden we've got to say, okay, we need to have a song during communion, and what does that mean with our singing elsewhere, and the songs we've chosen, and it's also Amy's last day, and we have a special rite of ascending and thanksgiving at the ending or conclusion of a call, and that's an important thing to do. So all those things had to be. So we have these last few weeks we've had multiple things: confirmation and reformation, going away with and the sing along with Chelsea. This weekend it's All Saints and this enhanced communion practice and Amy's goodbye. Then the week after we welcome 6 or 7 new members.
Oh, that many.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, we have the Jacksons want to come back. So, David and Mary Lou?
No.
Yeah. David and Mary Lou are coming back. They're going to rejoin. They were members and then they moved to Wisconsin and they went to a church. Actually, they went to a church with a classmate of mine. And then she retired. And she was a second career and she retired. So then they said they just felt that they'd like to come back. And so they're rejoining, officially joining.
From Wisconsin? They're coming all the way
New
from
Richland,
Wisconsin?
yeah. They come over from New Richland, yeah.
New
But
Richland.
I don't think they'll be here every weekend because it's a bit of a drive, but they like to be here. They've been on vacation for a while. And then Sherry, Myrna's niece, has not been a member. She's joining officially.
Oh.
And Bonnie, your sister-in-law, has transferred her membership from a church in Plymouth. It was Plymouth, right? Yeah.
Out west.
Out west, out on that Minneapolis side. Out west, in the hinterlands.
Over there.
Yeah, over there. And in far eastern North Dakota. Just a joke about being western Minnesota. Anyway, Bonnie. And then there's a woman named Mary Kay. You know her? Mary, let me find the name. She's really nice. She doesn't get to come much because she doesn't have transportation right now. So we have to get her here somehow.
Does she live far? Or?
No, she just lives up by across the highway, not very far. She just needs a ride. She's working on something. She'll have a ride soon. Let's see. See, that's October 1. I had these listed. Okay, Sherry, the Jacksons, Bonnie, Robin K. Smith. Do you know Robin K.? She's transferred over from somewhere else. She wasn't living here, but she was at Calvary in Golden Valley for years, for 50 years, and then she's moved to another place closer here, and she wants to join our church. So she's really nice. And then my wife Ellie and I will be recognized as new members. Sometimes we sort of forget to recognize the pastor, or the pastor doesn't want to be noticed, but I officially become a member upon call, but this is recognition of the members. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's nice. 7 new folks, and some who have only been involved really online since the beginning of COVID, and others who have been here and just haven't officially joined. Right? So that'll be. So what I see is this really interesting last 4 weeks of loss and rejoicing. We're losing Chelsea, who's been here. Eric was loved and did a very nice job. And saying goodbye. And then the next week, this welcoming 2 young kids on Reformation Sunday, we had 2 confirmands, which is a gain and rejoice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, a harder weekend with saying goodbye to Amy, another weekend of loss and rejoicing in her call continuing. But we also end up saying goodbye to Doug and I know Signe and Simon. They aren't. I haven't been here since I've been here, but I know they're part of this community. So you have those 4 people going away. Nora's going to remain committed and part of the community because she wants to be part of the youth. Will we see her much? I don't know. That's not the point. She wants to remain here for the time being. And then the next weekend we welcome 7 new people. So there's this really interesting up and down, and that's a lot of noise. You know, think about this. That's a lot of noise going on in our congregation right now. But God speaks to us not only through noise, but in this story, where?
Silence.
And that's silence. And so if we can listen for the silence, the spaces between the noise, the space between. There's I'm just going to ramble a little bit, but there's an interesting thing going on. Does anybody know this word? Are you familiar with this word, liminal?
Liminal.
Okay, liminal comes from the Latin limen, which means threshold. So a limen in Latin is that threshold that you pass over when you go from one room to another on the ground, on the door. There's always a limen will be maybe that strip. It's a threshold between one place to another. Liminal refers to those threshold spaces. It could be physical space, it could be time, and there's a lot of there's philosophers and there's theologians and there's other folks, academics and others, thinking about this time right now that we're going through as a liminal time. It's a time between ages, right? Because we have a clear, we know what, until just recently, we could see it coming, but you know, in the 60s, and even though a lot of upheaval in 70s, and even the 80s, into the 90s, there was still stability in the way things work. Organizations, structures, governments, how business worked, right? Top-down hierarchical structures worked and everything. But somehow, as we got into the 2000s, things started falling apart, you know? There's vast change going on in our culture. The people don't trust the institutions that carried us, right? When I was a kid, and I bet you all are somewhat the same time, I defined myself. My identity was shaped and defined by the institutions that I was part of. I was a Lutheran. I was a Coloradan. That's a state, right? That's an institution. That's a system. I was interested in academics, so my schools, my colleges, my high school, my colleges. I've only gone to 3, you know. I have a seminary, a grad school, and an undergrad experience, and my identity is shaped. I'm not only Scott, I'm Scott, who was this terrible Swede from Bethany College in Kansas. I'm a Missouri Tiger. I'm a Luther seminary heretic. That was our mascot, actually. And I'm an ELCA Lutheran. So those things shape me. Our younger folks don't identify themselves that way, in the same way. My daughter, for instance, has never known a time without a device that she could hold in her hand. And with that device, because the way it works, she's always had a opportunity to participate in the institutions that she identifies with. Not just she's always been able to broadcast in Snapchat and Instagram and all these different things where she participates in, instead of identifying with an institution like the Missouri Tigers or the Luther Seminary or the church. And that church, as being part of that, helps form and shape and mark who I am. She's had more access as those things change to sort of create her own identity. Well, that breaks down some of these other institutions break down. So it's no wonder the church is struggling to figure out, how do we reach new people? Why aren't people getting engaged? If any of you belong to anything like any like other organizations, Masons or Lions or any of those clubs and stuff,
My parents did.
they're struggling so bad, right?
Yeah,
Even worse than
yeah.
the church.
Yeah.
Because those were organizations that gave focus. So there's a change in the way that people are thinking and understanding what our identity is. And it's no wonder that now we have just this self-awareness that, what are your personal pronouns, right? I mean, I know it's confusing, but people participate in their own identity in a much different way now. So I can say, well, I identify as non-gendered. I'm not sure I'm a male. I identify with either males or females, but I'm going to present as a female. It's really interesting. I mean, kids are doing it all the time, and my talks about at school. I mean, she'll say, well, this is my friend so-and-so. So-and-so is a they, she. What's a they, she? Well, she identifies, she's not sure she's male, her identity, not necessarily her physical attributes, but the identity. I identify not as male or as female. I just identify as me. But I present, when I'm out I present as, I dress as female. And I present myself, which is really fascinating. And it's hard to wrap your head about it, but it's a reality in the world. It's a reality in the world that we're living in, especially with these young folks. And there's other things that go with this. There's this identity issue. There's the structural issue. How society is structured and order is kept. It's moving from institutions that sort of shape and hold things together to associations, looser associations and networks and things like that. And what we find is that people aren't as engaged in an institution like the church, but they might be engaged in relationships or networks that are Christian or faith-oriented, but they might be engaged in 5 of them instead of just going to one church, right? So it's really fascinating. Structural, then the speed of information, speed and access, unbelievable. I've always been really computerized or tuned in there, but the access to information and the misuse of that, where it becomes an access to disinformation. And we've seen the Russians, and we're probably pretty good at it too, we just don't know. But the Russians, for instance, we see that interference that they do culturally, and the Chinese and others, and how ISIS has used the speed and access to information to build a network of hate and control around the world. Well, we are in this liminal because we don't know where this is all going to lead to yet. The past we grew up in, these things I'm talking about, these broader things, are crumbling, but the future hasn't really emerged. What's it really going to settle into? Because it will settle into a state of, some state of stasis or
disarray.
Well, yeah, it might be disarray, right?
It is.
Yeah, it might end up in disarray. Phyllis Tickle, this is a great book if you want to, I got to remember, Phyllis Tickle was a Christian historian, she died some years ago. She wrote a book called The Great, I'll look it up, you might be really interested in it. But she makes this interesting, her theory is that since the birth of Christ, beginning with the birth of Christ, she didn't go back farther before that, but about every 500 years, we see this huge transition. That's a hue, not a hue transition. Transition. The first transition, after Christ was a huge transition culturally and religiously in the world. So there's Christ, AD 32, right? Yeah, I'm dyslexic today. And then about 500 was really when things settled in and the church was state church, okay? Constantine. When all that sort of... So when the church, the early Christian church went from being this wonderful little, or an outsider group, an outsider, persecuted and existing on the fringes and reaching out to the most, really drawing the people who were most persecuted, in Roman society at least, and in other societies. Constantine, at some point, declares the church to be, Christianity to be the state religion of Rome. And it changed. All of a sudden, we had these really interesting, the church becomes part of the state apparatus, right? And then, at 1000 AD, and I'm trying to remember, I think this has to do with following the Great Schism, some of the Great Schisms, and this is the one I can't remember as well, but there's another major shift here. And following the Great Schism is a consolidation of power where the church emerges as a political power. Church as a political player. Where it wasn't so, it was that's when, I looked that up at Phyllis Tickle. So the next big one is when? 1517. Luther and the press. So all of a sudden you have this monk challenging the power that the Roman Empire has. The Holy Roman Empire and of the Holy Roman Church. Because the empire was the German coalition. The Holy Roman Empire was the German churches and German leaders, plus along with the church in Rome, and all the power they had, and the selling of indulgences, and the fleecing of the poor, and all this. And that wouldn't have been possible had not been this technological evolution of the printing press, where people could start printing. Like somebody took and said, Gutenberg said, I'm going to print these 95 Theses, they're interesting. Had that not happened, Luther might have just ended up like so many other heretics. Burned at the stake.
Kind of unknown.
Yeah, or burned at the stake and driven out. But that was a major shift, and everything began to shift. And in the intervening years, what happened? The Enlightenment, right? The Reformation sort of proceeded along with the development of the Enlightenment, and
Technology
continued to include. You went through all these different. But now, 2000. The digital era. God, I can't even write. Digital era, right? Where all of a sudden, transfer of information is huge and fast and accessible to so many people. I have like 50 times more computing power in this phone than we had on the Apollo that landed on the moon.
Mm.
In that whole... There's more technology, speed, power, capability in this than they had in the whole that went to the moon and back. All those different things. That's just crazy to think about. And Phyllis Tickle just thinks that this is another one of those liminal periods where there's transition happening. We can't quite see it because it's still emerging. We can guess at it, we can plan for it, but we can't plan for everything. So we're in this liminal period.
But the Industrial Revolution falls within those.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
between
and
those things.
And what she also talks about is like things like the Industrial Revolution. What happens is the pace of change happens quicker, but society has a way to continue to respond static or stay in balance until something happens that's a huge tipping point. And she claimed that the digital era is a tipping point. Unlike the Industrial Revolution let things expand, but we were able to maintain without a total tipping point. We didn't understand some of the ramifications, some of the things that would come out of the Industrial Revolution, such as our terrible pollution, dependence on fossil fuels, what that's doing. We didn't recognize that. Humans didn't recognize that. But now there's a tipping point. If anybody wants to get this book,
yeah. Could you give the name?
Let me find it. Phyllis Tickle. She came to seminary a couple times.
So she's a St. Paulite? Or?
She's from Tennessee. She's like Methodist or Presbyterian. And I'm just interested in that, what's going on now. In the broader cultural milieu, the Great Emergence.
Oh, is that what it is?
It's the Great Emergence by Philip Tickle. How Christianity is changing and why. Now, it's broad strokes. And then she followed it up with another book called Emergence Christianity. The Christianity that is emerging out of these changes, which is fascinating. But this Great Emergence by Tickle is really worth a read. Very, very. I've got it at home. I sit down to read it, and I just couldn't put it down. I think I read it in like one setting, which I tend to do sometimes, which is not always easy when you're going to seminary at the same time. So, think about where we are in terms of this story. Okay, I think in terms of the story, and I'm really drawn to the silence, right? God appears in the silence, in those spaces between the noise, in those liminal spaces between something happening and another, and they might be imperceptible at times, but they're there.
They're nice.
Right, and that's. Now, I'm not going to preach liminality. I actually belong to something called the Guild of Liminality, where these professors and other thinkers around the country, in England mostly, we get together every quarter and somebody talks about their work, their academic work in exploring what's going on. In this space between, we don't really know what's coming. But God appears in the silence. And then you add to that, that's an interesting thing. And then we think about culturally, I can't even say, but culturally, we are in the midst of a lot of changes, right? We've just seen there's some incredible political change going on. There's technological change. There's social change. I mean, I feel somewhat blessed to have an experience of a daughter who's 18 going to college, and to get her insight of what things are going on. Even education's changed. Her college experience is going to be vastly different from mine. We only had a couple real alternatives. Now in Minnesota, here you can
have
lots of different ways of school. There's different paths to learning, and it doesn't have to be a university degree. There are other ways.
Thank goodness.
Right.
The world seems to be increasingly autocratic.
Well, I think autocraticism might be a response to what's going on the broader level. I think there's a ground level, and then the autocratic control is an attempt to wrest control and get things. Because autocratic, one leader or one particular voice, giving that person power, the idea is that person can maintain the power.
We've done that a couple of times. It hasn't been the best move we made either.
No.
Right.
No.
Definitely.
Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, I mean, those are just three in our, and millions of people die because it's a type of autocratic power. But I think that's a response, Peter. I think that's part of the power, the previous power structures, and understanding, still trying to wrest control or find control out of the changing, sifting sand that we don't know where it's going to end. But you have that culture thing, but then we have cross. And think about the spaces of transition we've been in. I mean, think about this. Okay. Then you add on the pandemic, which is like throwing gas on the fire. It's an accelerates. And then you have cross. And we're still, I think that we're still, in some respects, there's still parts of us that are still feeling the transition and the loss of Bob, who was here for so long, right?
Mm-hmm.
The transition of living in pandemic with an interim pastor, things having to happen, getting used to me, which will probably take a few decades, and I won't be here long enough. I won't be here long enough for you guys to get used to me. But that's, there's a new pastoral voice here. We had loss of people, right? We have a change in the last 5 years of this strengthened relationship. I mean, the change, I think, for Cross, one of the things I think is fascinating and wonderful is how long have we been doing the community market, which is the culmination. There was a transition from other things. This is our 5th year, so we're 5 years into this really sea change transition. Really stepping outside the doors in a different way than we probably had, because we did the backpacks and other things, right?
Yeah, we did that.
But the market's different. The market is markedly different, right? It's a different engagement with the community and a partnership with the school. And how long have we had the Latino congregations here?
Quite a while.
Can't answer that one. A while.
Not like 10 years.
Well,
Yeah,
10 or
probably.
less. 10
Yeah,
or less.
yeah, probably close to that.
Yeah. So that's a change.
But you have to change. Because
And then-
the words of every obituary should start out, we've never done it this way before.
Yeah. Or, oh darn, that didn't work out.
Yeah.
That wasn't a good
I
idea.
remember that one, yeah, I've done that a few times.
That wasn't a good idea. That's my last words. Oh, that wasn't a good idea. But okay, in particular, I mean, I don't want to downplay Chelsea. But now there's this other change. We're grieving. And so there are big losses and little losses. And the people that have gone away and haven't come back, or the people who have died, the people, and this is all in the context of, and they all are loud. These are all clashing cymbals and all these things. And I think how do we as a congregation also listen for that silence? That God in between the loudness and the banging and the... I think that's where I might be going, so don't be surprised if that's where the sermon goes, because it seems like we have a lot just pounding at us right now. Are you feeling it? Are you all feeling it in the same way? You're not?
Well, and you're feeling it in the fact that you want to move forward and you can't because it goes, and we're not out of that yet.
No.
And I had that experience with the meeting the other night with the Stewardship Outreach. I want to do more outreach. And it's like, okay, well, maybe we can write letters. I mean, I would love to be able to go back the Shores, for an example. They have given so much to us. I mean, they've given financially. They did the birthday bags for the backpack for years. we've had to let go of our other outreach. And it's like, okay, how can we continue to grow when we're always stopped? And that seems to be what the pandemic does, and it's not going to let go of us
Yeah.
for quite a while.
And I think you're right on, Sylvia. I think you're right on with that. But I want to say that much of my work as a pastor, and beyond what I do as a pastor, with the pastoral a lot of my work as a developer, and I still, I'm involved with the Academy of Religious Leadership, and I'm involved with the Guild of Liminality, is trying to say, how do we as the church, people of faith, how do we how is God leading us through this? And I do think that the way forward is increasingly clear for me. Not the steps that we need to do, but the way forward is to really look and discern, just to use this analogy, those quiet spaces between the noise. Because the noise can capture our attention, the noise can frighten us, the booms and the bangs and the splinters. God does appear in those quiet spaces. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean, and how do you do that? This is something I've been working on for 10 years in my career, is what does it mean to listen actively as a community for what God is saying when you are surrounded by noise? And that's hard. That's hard. One of the things I do, one of my practices with Lydia, it still goes on. I have this twice a week with 2 different groups. We've been meeting for 5 and 3 years, or 7 and 3 years, continued, once a week, for 3 and 7 years. Group the same 4 or 5 people. And I'm going to wipe the board clean for now. I don't take too much time. I'm deviating, I know. But this is important. I think it ties all into what God is calling us to do. There are 2 essential Greek words that have to do with with time, right? Chronos. There's linear time. Time as it goes from yesterday and today, now, right? Mm-hmm. Tomorrow. This chronos, when it's used in Greek, refers to time as it marches inevitably on. We're always in now, looking towards the future, remembering the past. And that is one way we can look at time. But that's chronos. And if you think about, what do they used to call a watch, a chronograph? Chronograph. That's where they get it. But then there's another word, which means kairos, which is God's time, or the breaking of God's time. It's not a time marked necessarily by days and minutes and past and future. Because God is not days and minutes and past and future. God is all in all, future and past and present. And there are ways, spiritual practices, where people in communities can start saying, I want to start looking for those moments where God's time is breaking in on my time. Right? Those little nudges on the shoulder saying, pay attention. I'm going to draw you out of what you're worried about the future, or and I don't want to say it's always sorrow for the past, but right now there's something going on. Right? Interesting
that Kronos is a pagan god.
There is a pagan god, King Kronos, yeah. But anyway, that in reference to time, and we have this practice that we do every week. It's called the Kairos Circle. And somebody will come in and say, I've got a kairos. We've turned it into a now, right? I've got a kairos. That means something, I think God is trying to tell me something. I've got a tap on the shoulder, or There's something working in my mind. And so in the group, the person describes what's going on. I was driving down the road, I saw a white squirrel off to the side of the road. I don't know why it touched me, but I saw a white squirrel, and I think God's trying to tell me something about white squirrels. I don't know what that is. And then everybody else is listening very carefully, and the others say, so, where do you think God is in this? We take it to this question, well, how might you think God is? If you think God's in it, where do you think that is? And we listen. And then we have some time for silence. Silence is good. In still a small voice. Listen to God in the silence. And then we come back and we have a question. Everybody who else is listening, they offer a clarifying question. A question. Not a solution, never a solution. Well, you should, forget those squirrels. It's just a squirrel after all. Are you sure it was a squirrel and not a rabbit? Clarifying question. And because everybody, as we listen carefully to other people, questions come to mind. And we're trusting that the Spirit's in the midst of this whole process, helping us discern together. And then after everybody's had a chance to ask her a question, a little more silence, we come back and we offer a gift. And that gift is a image, a Bible lesson, a hymn, something that sort of came to you as you were thinking about that you want to share with the other person. Okay, I was thinking about white squirrels, and I'm really thinking about Noah's Ark. I just want to offer Noah's Ark. And they came 2 by 2, blah, 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 blah. And that person is taking all these gifts, and then they listen, and we come back and we ask a question. Might as well be, why are you here? Who are you? Who are you in your identity in Christ? Who are you? What does all this say about who you are in God's world, in God's mind? And almost always people can say, I'm a beloved child of God, or it relates to something deep that's going on in their life. And so, and you ask, what does God ask me to do about it? And they might say, God has asked me to find the other white squirrels so they can have a pair of them and get on Noah's Ark. I'm joking about that, but it's a process, it's a spiritual practice that's been used for centuries, that's been adapted to this idea. And what happens, then we say, okay, tell us about it next week when we get together. Well, we'll sort of check in and see how it's going. But it's a time for us as a community, as people, to stop and say, what's going on? Why are you here? Why are you? I think that's a question. I think that's the question he's asking, that God is asking of Elisha. What's going on? Why are you here? It's that deeper question. What's going on? And this is a practice. I have 2 groups. I was in one for 7 years, and then my one group right now, I don't think it's 7, it's 6 years old, and the other's on its 3rd year. Every week we get together for an hour, just an hour, and it changes the way, when I have something that sort of, I can't quite get what's going on, I bring it to the group. We can combine it with a Bible study and some other stuff, but it's one way to get at those still, quiet voices, that stillness, God in the stillness. Between breaths.
Oh,
yeah, go on. No, please, just speak out.
Well, I think also an individual can get this through church and through a Bible study at home, too, type of a thing where I don't have Kairos, but I'm going to sit and try to hear God at home and try to hear it. Even the quiet times at church that we have during the service.
Yeah, I think we could make more of that, and we don't. I think we could. sometimes we try to keep things just so rolling along, we forget that there is a space for silence in the church.
And you've done that. You have done that. And I think that's really good.
Yeah. Well,
I'm sorry, I have
no.
to leave.
Oh.
Sylvia, no, that's all right. We ought to quit up. I've diverted a lot today. But the thing is, one thing I'd be interested, if anybody was interested in joining one of these Kairos groups, I'd be more than willing down the road to start one. But I'd ask that weekly endeavor, and together what happens is it changes the way you develop a new practice for listening to God. And I found myself less likely to say, oh, I know how to take care of that, or I'm going to pull ahead and do something. That was my demeanor years ago. I'll just take care of it because I'm a man. Right? I've got gifts. To sit back and let the silence work. There are contemplative prayer practices that are really interesting too. And some of them just have to do with finding a quiet. I actually have an app on my phone that is a contemplative prayer app. And the way it works, I was actually in a contemplative prayer group for a while, but my time when I started here, I couldn't continue it. Let me find this. My daughter decided it'd be a good idea if I put all my apps into little folders. But my problem is I can't read the folders well enough to know what the heck they're saying because my eyesight is going. And I guess that happens.
Yeah, it'll happen.
It's already happened. It's already happened. They're not making me happy.
Some people, it happens at age 10.
Yeah, well, I have been wearing glasses since I was in 4th grade.
Oh, good for you.
No, it's getting worse though right now. I was really in good space for years, and now it's in the church. So centering prayer. So it starts with an opening prayer, a little scripture, and then there's a time to sit in silence. You just get comfortable, and actually this has got a timer. I can make 10 minutes of silence. I just get comfortable, and in contemplative prayer, one of the things is to try to empty your mind of any of those distracting thoughts that come. And the way I was taught to do it is you find a phrase or a word. And whenever those distracting thoughts come, you repeat that word in your mind to the point that you want to just sort of be blank to what God gives you instead of those distracting thoughts. I've got to go mow the lawn, or I'm not very happy with the way that this turned out, or I'm worried about are the Broncos going to get a quarterback worth a game. All those things that tend to intrude on us. And it's important and frivolous, right? I'm a sports fan, and so all my sports fandom is totally frivolous. I know that. I'm not the one out there scoring the goals and making the touchdowns. That's another way to get into that practice. Journaling and writing is another one.
And in that contemporary prayer, do they...
contemplative.
I'm sorry?
Contemplative. Contemplative prayer. Don't
they ask you to write down those things that are in your mind?
Sometimes.
To get rid of it?
Or just... You can. That's a form. There's different forms. The contemplative prayer practice that I was introduced to, I did it for about 4 months with a group of other pastors. Introduced to me by a pastor, another interim. We just thought it'd be a nice practice for us to share. He really believes in it, and it helps him, helps settle him and center him. It's called centering prayer, actually. It's not contemplative, it's centering. It's a form of but you center in on being as open as you can to what God might be coming to you. And you don't look for it, you just sit and wait for the silence. It's pretty interesting. On Zoom, it's flipping amazing interesting because you have 6 or 8 people in a room and you open your eyes and everybody's out, and it's quiet. You have your headphones in, your mind is a little too frenetic, I think, for that. Yeah. There's other forms, contemplative music. There's Taizé. We use some Taizé music in worship. The whole Taizé movement. Are you familiar with Taizé?
Somewhat.
Yeah, it was a non-Catholic, non-denominational monastic movement in Taizé, France. And it started before World War II, but during World War II they took in lots of Jewish and Gypsy and other people fleeing the Nazi regime and helped them and hid them. And their worship is very much involved with silence and repetitive song and light candles and simplicity. Stay with me, remain here with me, watch and pray, watch and pray. That's a Taizé song, and that they're sort of repetitive. Beautiful sort of flowing music, not a lot of fireworks and bangs and loud noises. It's just sort of. And I was introduced to Taizé because my professor at the seminary, my worship professor, his name is Dirk Lang. Dirk was a Canadian Lutheran, grew up in Winnipeg, and went to seminary. And then while he was like doing internship or something in seminary, he was visited Taizé, the community in France, and he was really felt called to. So he put his call on hold, and I think it was an internship, and he entered the Brotherhood. It's a monk. I mean, it's a monastery, right? So he became a Taizé brother, a Lutheran Taizé brother. And he, over time, rose to the rank where he was two interesting things. He was the director of worship for Taizé, like second to Brother whatever who started it. And then he was also very, very active in the underground church in Czechoslovakia when the Czech people, through prayer and candlelight vigils, brought the Czech government to its knees. They'd gather at night and sing. And he was being hunted by Stajnost, this Czech secret police, while he was sneaking into Czech. He tells these amazing stories going in and helping organize the underground church there. Well, sometime along there, he's a happy monk. He meets a woman from Poland who's quite beautiful, and he's taken by her, and he renounces his vows and gets married, and he goes back to the United States with his wife. And somewhere here he picks up his PhD, and he teaches for a while in either Gettysburg or Philadelphia, and he's called to Luther to teach, and he was one of my professors. And I actually was in a Bible study with him at a church, and I wear my Taizé, this is a Taizé cross, the little spirit cross. And I've never been, but one of the gentlemen, he was my mentor during my internship. His name was Pastor Bob Nervig. And Bob had been the pastor who helped start the Lutheran camp system in the ALC back in the 40s. In upstate New York, there was, I think it was called Kairos, I think it was an art camp in upstate New York, and Bob started that. And then he and one of the other members of our church at Westwood were instrumental in the early youth gatherings. They designed and ran all the youth gatherings for the ALC youth before the ELCA. And then they were involved in the early youth quakes and stuff with the ELCA. And when Bob was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of liver cancer when I was in the middle of my internship and died, but we had a Bible study with him. And Dirk came to that Bible study all the time, and with other pastors in that area. And I got to know him real well as a professor and then as a friend. And 2 years ago, Dirk was called from the seminary to Lutheran World Federation. He had actually done some work with the Lutheran World Federation. Remember the 500th anniversary celebration in Lund, Sweden, when the Pope came and they celebrated the Reformation this is in 2017, 4 years ago. They had a big, the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church and the Pope, and Martin Jungel, who was the head of the Lutheran World Federation, and Archbishop Curry, who was connected with he wasn't whoever the Archbishop of the big bishop of the Anglican Church was there. And we celebrated the Reformation with a major prayer service. Dirk helped design that, and he worked at the Vatican, and he got to know Pope Francis. And then he was called 2 years, maybe 3 years ago, to the Lutheran World Federation. He is in charge of ecumenical relationships, and he's in the midst of all the discussions with Rome. He's back and forth from Geneva to Rome. And every once in a while I'll have something on Facebook or or something, and Dirk will say, "Oh, that's fantastic. How you do it? I follow you." He follows us, you know. This guy sitting at Lutheran World Federation with this connection will maybe see what we're doing across. And fascinating guy, beautiful guy, and he was very much. He had a contemplative mindset, but he's one of the best theologian worship guys out there. He really understands the history and the formation and the ongoing change, things that are happening in Lutheran worship, and have done. So he was a great professor. I took my Reformation class, which really was on the Lutheran Reformation. It was co-taught by him and somebody else too. So I had at least two with Dirk. I think I might have had one other. I did have one other. What was that? It was a really interesting course too. I'm not here to name drop. I'm just saying that there's some really fascinating things out there, fascinating people. As a matter of fact, when COVID first hit and people were saying, how do we manage communion when we're separate? Because typically, communion was always an in-person. Can you have, is it efficacious, is it appropriate to have separate communion where you bring your own elements, right? You have your bread and your wine, or cookie and grape juice, or whatever some people might have, you know. Is it still communion? Is God still present? You know, this question. And there were a bunch of conversations on Facebook, and then also in a forum I'm part of, Luther, called Faith Lead. And Dirk was really into that, and so I was thinking about how might that. I wanted to read up more and study a little deeper, and I sent Dirk a note saying, would you recommend a couple books that are really exhaustive, that give me of the history of the development of worship, right, and communion and these different rites, because it's fascinating how things have changed and how knowledge and understanding and practice has adapted over the centuries. We don't practice like early Christians do, very little bit, do we? We read. The basic framework remains. We gather, word, meal, sent. That's the basic, they call that the ordo, which is Latin for order, right? You have Latin, don't you?
In college, I've lost it.
Yeah, I wish I would have taken it, but the ordo, and it's as basic as that. We gather, we hear the word, read, preached, sung, we share the meal. And then sacraments, the other sacrament, baptism is something we do as once for a person, and we remember that. The baptismal life is sort of the entry into the community and also into the Christian